We were just killing time in a cold garage, watching an old movie on a flickering screen, when my brother said something so unexpected it quietly shifted the way I understood my family myself, and the silence we had been sharing for years. Greetings, dear listeners. Before I begin telling this complicated story of my life, I ask you to support our channel, subscribe, leave a like, and write in the comments which city you are listening from. This is very important for us. And now, enjoy listening. The garage had always been our unofficial living room, the place where unfinished projects went to rest and conversations waited until they were ready to happen. That evening, it smelled faintly of motor oil and old cardboard, mixed with the buttery salt of popcorn we burned slightly in the microwave inside. The space heater hummed near our feet, working harder than it should have, and the concrete floor held onto the cold no matter how many winters pass over it. We were sitting side by side on mismatched lawn chairs, watching a movie projected onto a wrinkled white sheet tacked to the wall. It was one of those old films our dad loved, the kind where the pacing was slow and the dialogue felt heavier than the action. I don't even remember the plot now, just the sound of the characters' voices echoing softly in the garage, blending with the distant noise of a passing car outside. I was 22 then, in that strange in-between age where you're old enough to know better, but still young enough to feel unsure about almost everything. I had come home for a few days to reset, or maybe to hide. I hadn't decided which. My brother, Mark, was 3 years older, already settled into a version of adulthood that looked steady from the outside. A job, a routine, a calmness I both admired and resented a little. We hadn't planned to watch a movie together. It just happened the way these things often do, without announcement or expectation. I think that's why it felt so easy at first. We didn't have to talk. We just sat there, sharing the same screen, the same thin blanket over our laps, our shoulders occasionally brushing when one of us shifted. I remember thinking how strange it was that silence with him didn't feel awkward the way it did with other people. It felt familiar, like an old song you don't notice anymore because it's always been playing in the background. I let myself sink into that feeling, my eyes half on the movie, half on the dust floating through the projector's beam. About halfway through, Mark adjusted in his chair. I heard the metal legs scrape softly against the concrete. I assumed he was just uncomfortable, maybe cold. I didn't look at him right away. I kept my eyes on the screen, on a scene where the main character was staring out a window, clearly thinking about something he couldn't say out loud. Then my brother spoke. It wasn't loud. He didn't pause the movie. He just said my name, calmly, the way he always had when he wanted my attention but didn't want to startle me. I turned to look at him, expecting a joke or a comment about the film. Instead, he was staring straight ahead, his hands folded together, his jaw set in a way that told me this wasn't casual. "Do you ever feel like you're running out of time?" he asked, even though everyone keeps telling you you're young. The question caught me off guard. It didn't match the moment, didn't fit the easy quiet we'd been sharing. For a second, I thought he might be talking about himself, or maybe quoting the movie, but when he finally glanced at me, his eyes were serious, searching. I felt something shift inside my chest, a subtle tightening. I shrugged at first, buying myself time. "All the time," I said honestly. "Isn't that normal?" He nodded, but it was slow, thoughtful. The movie kept playing, the characters unaware that something more important was unfolding in our small garage. Mark took a breath, then let it out carefully, as if he'd been holding it for years. "I used to think I had to have everything figured out by now," he said. "I thought being the older one meant I was supposed to know how to protect you from feeling lost." His words landed heavier than I expected. I'd never heard him talk like that before. Growing up, he'd been steady, teasing, sometimes distant, but always reliable. The idea that he had worried about me in that way, quietly, without saying anything, stirred something warm and aching in me. I didn't interrupt him. I could sense that if I did, the moment might slip away. "I realized recently," he continued, "that I don't always know what I'm doing either. And that pretending I do doesn't help you, or me." The heater clicked off, plunging the garage into a sharper cold, but I barely noticed. I was too focused on the sound of his voice, on the honesty threaded through it. I felt seen in a way I hadn't expected that night, not by him, not here. I swallowed, choosing my words carefully. I never needed you to have all the answers, I said. I just needed to know you were there. He smiled then, small and genuine, the kind of smile that carries relief. I am, he said simply. The movie ended not long after, the credits rolling silently because neither of us bothered to turn the sound back up. We sat there for a few more minutes, the projector light fading, the garage returning to its usual shadows. As we stood to clean up, I realized something important had changed. Not dramatically, not all at once, but enough to matter. That night wasn't about a movie or even about what my brother said. It was about understanding that growing up doesn't mean growing apart, and that sometimes the most unexpected conversations are the ones that help you see yourself more clearly. I carried that realization with me as I turned off the lights and closed the garage door, feeling, for the first time in a while, quietly grounded. The next morning, the house felt different, though nothing had physically changed. The same pale sunlight slipped through the kitchen blinds, landing in thin stripes across the table. The same old clock ticked above the refrigerator, stubborn and loud in the quiet. But I moved through the space with a new awareness, like I'd stepped half an inch to the left of my usual life and was seeing it from a slightly altered angle. Mark was already awake when I came downstairs. He stood at the counter, pouring coffee into a chipped mug we'd had since high school. He looked normal, relaxed even, wearing an old sweatshirt with the sleeves pushed up. For a moment, I wondered if the conversation in the garage had meant as much to him as it had to me, or if he'd already filed it away and moved on. "Morning," he said, glancing over his shoulder. "Morning," I replied, my voice still thick with sleep. We sat across from each other at the table, steam rising from our mugs. The silence wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't empty either. It felt full, like there were things floating between us that didn't need to be named right away. I wrapped my hands around the warm ceramic, grounding myself in the moment. "I was thinking about what you said last night," I began, surprised at my own willingness to continue the conversation. Part of me had expected us to pretend it hadn't happened, to retreat into safer territory. He nodded, inviting me to go on. "I didn't realize how much pressure you put on yourself," I said. "Growing up, I always thought you were just confident, like things came easier to you." He let out a quiet laugh, shaking his head. "I was good at acting," he said. "I figured if I looked calm, maybe eventually I'd feel that way." His honesty made me smile, but it also made my chest ache. I thought about all the times I compared myself to him, measuring my uncertainty against his apparent stability. It hadn't occurred to me that he might be doing the same thing, just in reverse. After breakfast, we decided to take a walk. The neighborhood hadn't changed much since we were kids. The sidewalks were cracked in the same places, the trees taller but familiar. As we walked side by side, our steps fell into an easy rhythm. I noticed small details I hadn't paid attention to before. The way he slowed his pace to match mine, the way he listened without interrupting. At one point, we passed the old park where we used to spend entire summers. The swings creaked softly in the breeze, empty now. I stopped without thinking. "Do you remember," I asked, "when I fell off the monkey bars and refused to cry because you were watching?" He smiled at the memory. "I remember being terrified you were hurt and pretending not to be so you wouldn't feel worse." We stood there for a moment, sharing the weight of that small, shared history. It struck me then how much of our lives had been shaped by unspoken agreements, quiet roles we'd accepted without question. The protector, the one being protected. Neither of us had ever asked if those roles still fit. As we continued walking, the conversation drifted to lighter things, but the undercurrent remained. I found myself opening up about my doubts, about the pressure I felt to choose the right path, the fear of disappointing people I love. Saying it out loud made it feel more manageable, less like a private failure, and more like a shared human experience. Mark listened carefully, occasionally nodding, never rushing me. "You don't owe anyone a perfect version of your life," he said gently, "especially not me." That sentence stayed with me. It was simple, but it carried permission I hadn't realized I needed. Later that afternoon, back in the garage, I sat alone for a while. The lawn chairs were still where we'd left them, the projector unplugged. I ran my fingers along the edge of the old workbench, feeling the grooves worn smooth over time. The space felt like a witness, holding the echoes of our conversation without judgment. I realized then that personal discovery doesn't always come from dramatic moments or big decisions. Sometimes it comes from seeing the people you love as they truly are, not as the roles you've assigned them. That understanding softened something in me, a tightness I hadn't known I was carrying. When Mark came back in to grab a toolbox, we exchanged a look, a quiet acknowledgement. Nothing more needed to be said. As the day faded into evening, I felt steadier, more present. Not because I suddenly had answers, but because I knew I didn't have to face the questions alone. And for the first time in a long while, that was enough. That night, I couldn't sleep. The house settled around me the way it always had, with soft creaks in the walls and the occasional sigh of the heating system kicking on and off. My old bedroom felt smaller than I remembered, the ceiling closer, the air heavier with memories I hadn't planned on unpacking. I lay on my back, staring at the faint glow of streetlight leaking through the curtains, replaying the past day in quiet fragments. What surprised me most wasn't what Mark had said, but how safe I felt hearing it. There was a comfort in knowing that the person I'd always assumed was unshakable had cracks too, not flaws exactly, just places where life had pressed a little harder. Somehow, that made him feel closer, more human, and it made me reconsider the way I'd been holding myself together, rigid and guarded, afraid that admitting uncertainty would make me smaller. Sometime after midnight, I heard footsteps in the hallway. I assumed Mark was grabbing water or heading to the bathroom, but then there was a soft knock on my door. It wasn't urgent, just tentative enough to make me sit up. "Yeah?" I called quietly. The door opened a few inches. "You awake?" he asked. "Obviously," I said, trying to sound lighter than I felt. He stepped in, closing the door behind him. The room filled with that familiar presence, the same one that used to sit on the edge of my bed when we were kids and I'd had a bad dream. He didn't sit this time. He leaned against the dresser, arms crossed, like he wasn't sure how long he planned to stay. "I kept thinking about earlier," he said. "About what you said, about not needing answers." I waited, giving him space. The silence between us felt intentional now, like a pause in music rather than an absence of sound. "I don't say this enough," he continued, "but I'm proud of you. Not for what you're doing or what you might do next. Just for who you are. For the way you keep going even when you're unsure." My throat tightened. Compliments had always made me uncomfortable, especially from family. They felt too close, too exposing. But this one landed differently. It wasn't inflated or dramatic. It was quiet and sincere, and that made it harder to deflect. "Thanks," I said softly. "That means more than you probably realize." He nodded, looking relieved, as if he'd been carrying that sentence around for a while and was glad to finally set it down. "I spent a long time thinking it was my job to shield you from everything," he admitted. "But I'm starting to see that you don't need shielding. You need honesty." That word stayed with me. Honesty. Not protection, not control, just truth shared without conditions. I realized how rarely we offered that to the people closest to us, choosing instead to perform versions of ourselves we thought they expected. After he left, I lay back down, my mind quieter than it had been in weeks. I didn't fall asleep right away, but I wasn't restless either. I felt settled, like something essential had been acknowledged. The next day, we drove into town together. It was a small place, the kind where nothing ever really disappeared. It just aged. The storefronts were familiar, the streets lined with memories I hadn't visited in years. As Mark drove, one hand resting casually on the steering wheel, I watched the scenery roll by and felt oddly present, as if I wasn't rushing toward the future or clinging to the past. We stopped for lunch at a diner we used to go to after school. The vinyl booths were cracked, the menus unchanged. Sitting across from him, I noticed how easily conversation flowed now. There was no performance, no pressure to impress or reassure. We talked about ordinary things, but underneath it all was a shared understanding that we didn't have to hide the harder parts anymore. At one point, he asked, "What do you want, really? Not what you think you should want." The question lingered. I didn't answer right away. Instead, I stared at my glass of water, the condensation pooling on the table. "I want to feel like I'm allowed to take my time," I finally said. "Like I don't have to justify every choice I make." He smiled gently. "You are, and you don't." That simple exchange shifted something inside me. It wasn't permission I needed from him, not exactly. It was the realization that the expectations I felt so burdened by weren't as rigid as I'd imagined. Some of them had existed only in my head. On the drive home, the sky darkened with gathering clouds. The first drops of rain hit the windshield just as we pulled into the driveway. We sat there for a moment, listening to the rain drum softly against the roof of the car. "I'm glad you came home," Mark said. "Me too," I replied, and I meant it. As I stepped out into the cool air, I felt changed in a way that was subtle but lasting. Not transformed, not fixed, but more open. More honest with myself about who I was and who I was becoming. I didn't know yet where that understanding would lead, but for the first time in a long while, I trusted that wherever it was, I wouldn't have to walk there alone. The morning I left felt quieter than the others, as if the house itself knew something was ending and didn't want to interrupt it. I woke before my alarm, the sky outside still pale and undecided. My suitcase sat by the door, already packed, its zipper closed with a finality I wasn't sure I was ready for. I moved slowly, giving myself time to feel everything instead of rushing past it the way I usually did. In the kitchen, Mark was already there. He leaned against the counter, scrolling through his phone, a mug of coffee untouched beside him. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled in that familiar, steady way. "You heading out soon?" he asked. "Yeah," I said. I didn't want to leave without saying goodbye properly. We sat at the table again, the same place where so many ordinary mornings had passed without meaning much at all. Now it felt different, charged with awareness. Sunlight crept in through the window, warming the surface of the table, catching dust motes in the air. "I've been thinking," I said, surprising myself with how calm my voice sounded, "about how easy it is to forget that the people who know us the longest are still learning us too." He nodded, "And we're learning them, even after all this time." There was a mutual respect in that acknowledgement, an understanding that neither of us was frozen in the past version of our relationship. We were allowed to change, allowed to meet each other again, where we were now. When it was time to go, he walked me to my car. The driveway was damp from last night's rain, the air cool and clean. I set my suitcase in the trunk and turned back to face him, suddenly aware that this moment would stay with me longer than I expected. "Don't disappear," he said, half joking, half serious. "I won't," I replied, "and you don't have to worry so much." He smiled. "I know. I'm working on it." We hugged then, not rushed, not awkward, just solid and real. As I pulled away and got into the car, I felt a quiet confidence settle over me. Not certainty, not answers, but trust. Trust in myself, and in the bond we'd allowed to grow instead of leaving it stuck where it had been. The drive back felt different from the one that had brought me home days earlier. The road stretched out ahead of me, familiar but no longer intimidating. I let my thoughts wander, replaying moments from the garage, the kitchen, the late-night conversation that had shifted something deep inside me. I realized that personal discovery doesn't always arrive with grand revelations. Sometimes it comes in the form of a shared silence, an honest question, or a simple statement spoken without expectation. Sometimes it's recognizing that you don't have to carry everything alone, that vulnerability doesn't weaken connection, it strengthens it. By the time I reached the edge of town, I felt lighter. Not because my life was suddenly clear, but because I was no longer afraid of the uncertainty. I understood now that growth wasn't about racing toward a finish line. It was about allowing yourself to pause, to listen, and to let the people who care about you see the real version of who you are. That night, alone in my apartment, I unpacked slowly. I placed familiar items